I'm your host, Adam, and joining me... God damn it, I don't want to say my last name, I've decided. Fucking crazy people. Alright, we're starting this over.
Let's do it again.
Welcome back to another episode of the Games Gone By podcast. I'm your host, Adam, and joining me today, as always, the gaming expert enthusiast, Austin. How you doing, Austin?
Hey, man. Good to be here. Ready to talk about some scary stuff.
Absolutely. And returning today, Jeff. How you doing, man?
Oh, I'm doing great. Did you guys know that I love horror games? Because I do.
I didn't, but...
Now we know. I don't love horror games, so this will be interesting.
And I'm kind of in the middle, so we do have the full gambit there. And today we are going to be talking about Alan Wake, specifically the remastered version. I think we kind of got onto this when Alan Wake 2 was just running through the Game Awards, getting all these awards, and kind of caught all of us off guard because we were thinking Zelda, Spider-Man, whatever else. And I had played this game back when it came out, but I didn't have like a great memory of it. So we all decided to just dive in. And, what were you guys' overall impressions of this game?
Well, this is definitely something that's been on my list for... I definitely bought it when it came out in 2011. So I was happy to get something in my gigantic backlog off my plate and actually play it. It was a great time. I'm sure it was a top-notch game in 2011, and it still holds up 13 years later. At least I think so. Austin, how scared were you?
So I've obviously known about Alan Wake for a long time. I have played Remedy's later games, Control, Quantum Break, but I never touched Alan Wake. And I went into this thinking it was going to be kind of scary, but I was actually really... I thought the horror was really effective in the early parts of the game, for sure. Way scarier than I thought it would be. But I did end up having a great time with it, and I'm glad I finally got to it.
It is interesting how it starts off with really playing into those horror elements a little more, and maybe it's simply because the mystery just kind of gets revealed over time, so it's a little less, I guess, mysterious. But I would agree, early on, there's even a few jump scares that I was like, whoa, if this game is going to be like this, I'm going to need to, wear an extra pair of underwear over here. But it's really not that bad as it goes on, and I think but it never really reaches cheesiness either. It doesn't get flat. I think it maintains the atmosphere it needs to without just resorting to, cheap scares the whole time.
Yeah, the beginning for me definitely felt more like it was leaning into the jump scares and really building the atmosphere to where everything was really creepy, and some of the jump scare stuff kind of fades away as the game goes on, and it just leans more into the kind of atmospheric horror. But as the mystery gets revealed, it's obviously a little less scary as you kind of understand what's going on in the world.
So would you guys definitely call this... Well, it's certainly a horror game, but does it feel like a shooter at all at times, or even a puzzle game? I do struggle to put this game in a genre, because it's not quite like another horror game I love, Amnesia, because you can directly fight the monsters. You get a gun, right? Mm-hmm. But yeah, so I'm not sure what to call it besides a horror game. Do you guys have any thoughts there?
It does bounce around between a few genres for sure, and I think this was really the start of gaming kind of going that way in general. Now every good game that comes out is 17 different genres, right? So I think this was really just kind of the start of that blend, and it is mostly a third-person shooter with horror elements is probably how I would describe, because it doesn't dive into the horror as much as something like Amnesia or Outlast, but it's also got it, and it's not a just cheap thrill shooter either. This doesn't feel like, I don't know, brute force for the original Xbox. It's a decent third-person shooting mechanic intertwined with all of these narrative and horror elements, I think.
Yeah, for sure. So let's dive into that a bit more. Austin, can you kind of describe just the gameplay of Alan Wake?
Yeah, so Alan Wake is very, very much like you were talking about, kind of a shooter, but the kind of gimmick with Alan Wake is that you have a flashlight, and you have to use that flashlight to kind of weaken the creatures that you're fighting, called the Taken. You weaken them with the flashlight, and once the darkness around them is dispelled, you can shoot them. And the gun kind of auto-locks for you, I found at least. The gun kind of aims to the point where you need to aim, so you're not having to focus really heavy on aiming. It's mostly just avoiding enemies, weaken them with the flashlight, and then shoot them with the gun. And I thought that loop was pretty effective for the majority of the game. Kind of towards the end, it starts to maybe wear thin a little bit, but the game does give you tools throughout, like a shotgun or, a flare gun to kind of amplify your tool set to deal with these creatures.
Yeah, I think that's one of its really big strong points is the set of tools you get throughout the game. Like, so it's divided up into 6 episodes, right? And in episode 1, you pretty much have the wimpiest flashlight and a revolver that you reload by putting 1 bullet in at a time, which is just a fantastic mechanic that we'll talk more about. And then by the end of it, you're running around with like flashbang grenades, flares, and a flare gun that could one-shot enemies. And I just think the progression throughout the 6 episodes, they really nailed. Like, some games can either like drag out the opening and you get bored, or you turn into Rambo 6 seconds in, and suddenly it kind of loses the appeal of the sort of puzzle-like encounters they have set up. Do you agree, Adam?
Yeah, I thought they ramped up your kind of power level in a really steady and appealing way. Nothing's really over the top until it's time for it to be over the top. You have like 3 different kinds of flashlights. You get a couple different kinds of shotguns or a hunting rifle. I think you just get the revolver in the base game, right? No other pistol types.
Yeah, that was the one.
Yeah, it's just a lot of fun. You know, they really lean into the light versus darkness thing, so everything kind of revolves around that. So that's why you get bigger flashlights and flares and flashbangs instead of, rocket launchers or whatever like you would in another game. It's all kind of based around using that light to fight the darkness.
I will say I was irrationally excited the first time I got a flashlight upgrade. I was like, oh, no way, there's more, it gets bigger. It was great.
More powerful flashlights. Like, that's such a weird concept for a video game, right? Like, getting excited over a more powerful flashlight. But they really do make it, like, very exciting to get better light-based tools, which is pretty cool.
I don't know if you guys found yourself doing this, but earlier in the game, I was constantly trying to knock off people's brightness without focusing, so I didn't want to use all my batteries. And then, like, after the second chapter, it just becomes apparent that I'm never going to run out of these. So it's weird to me that the first two chapters, maybe third chapter, is so strict about your resources. I actually ran out multiple times, and I think after the halfway point, that just never came close to happening again.
Yeah, it definitely heavily emphasizes like resource management, right? Like, this is not a spray and play game. You got to pay attention to your flares, to your ammunition, how many bullets are even loaded. And the flashlight meter is a lot of fun. I was definitely right there with you, Adam. I was trying to do as much light damage like collectively as I could. And then by the end of it, you get that heavy duty lantern, right? And I'm like almost sprinting at the enemies, like shining the flashlight in their face, like, interrogator style, and then gunning them down, which really didn't happen until near the end of the game. So that was a lot of fun to finally feel like I was winning the battle and turning the tide, as opposed to constantly like being on the run and desperate not to, pull the trigger and hear a click.
Even in those early chapters, while resource management is obviously very important, the game does do a great job of like encouraging you to follow these like writings on the wall that, you find out a character is kind of written for you, but it encourages you to follow these paths kind of off the main path and find all these like hidden caches of like extra batteries, extra weapons, like giving you these tools where you have to go out of your way to find them. But when you do, like, it's very rewarding for it. I found pretty much every time.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue into talking a bit about level design. And for this kind of game, I almost don't want to call it level design. It almost feels like set design, like the different pieces they put in to make it a real horror game and make it unique. And the invisible writing, I think, was one of the best things they did, because it like feeds into a reward for exploration, right? Like, if you're thorough, if you're paying attention and you shine your flashlight around on different objects, you will see this yellow paint show up that'll point you to weapons caches. The first one I found, I think, was at the beginning of episode 2. It leads you into Moonshine Cavern, one of the attractions at this Pacific Northwest mountain town you're staying at or whatever.
Right.
And you could completely miss it. But if you go in there, you will find what was for me the first shotgun, which felt like a great reward for like paying attention and going off the beaten path.
The yellow writing to me is one of my favorite examples of all time of something that really merges narrative and gameplay together. And at the beginning, you don't necessarily know where it's coming from. I kind of thought maybe it was just kind of a cheap gameplay thing. But as the narrative progresses, you find out who's writing that and why. And it actually makes a ton of sense why there is writing left behind showing you caches of flares and flare guns and all these things. It's just such a great element to this game that merges those two aspects, I think, just very well.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of games can have like one-dimensional throwaway characters, right? Because you find out it's the Lady of the Light, right? That's writing these secret messages for you, who you meet at the beginning of the game in episode 1 as a creepy old lady who's obsessed with don't go into the dark.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. She's been prepping the town you're staying in for the fight against darkness for 30 years. So, like, she's not just a throwaway bit character to unsettle you at the beginning. Like, she's part of the whole plot, which I really appreciate when, like, every moment in the game is tied into the overall experience. What were your impressions of, maybe, do you remember when you first come off the boat in the game and sort of, like, meet and greet the NPCs for the first time?
Yeah. There is definitely a sense of like unsettling in the town, right? You kind of get there, and the first person I can like vividly remember talking to is Rose at the bar. There's just this like sense of uneasiness with all the people in the town. Like it's got the small town vibe, but something feels off. And as you go on, and right, that's kind of the point of a horror game, right? You want to feel uneasy. And I thought they nailed that just right first thing going in. All the characters act like you would imagine like small town characters would, but they're just a little bit off, which I thought was really effective.
Yeah, Rose is like your biggest fan, right? She's got your cutout in the doorway of her small town diner,
which is really uncomfortable.
It also kind of leads into Alan being kind of a dick for the first time, right?
Oh God, he's kind of the worst.
He is the tortured auteur kind of like, he's going to be directing indie films later where he's abusive on the set. Like you can feel it. But I do like how it plays off those kind of horror movie tropes of like, this is a small town. These people are weird. And then of course, one of them who is the most weird turns out to be weird for a very good reason. And it kind of plays into the whole thing. A lot of little classic horror tropes like that. I think they weave in pretty organically.
Which one are you calling the weirdest? Sorry, we should just go ahead and dispense with spoilers, right? We're going to spoil the rest of the plot, right?
Oh, completely, yeah. I'll put that in the description of the episode.
Yeah. There's no way we can avoid it, I think, with a game like this.
Yeah, sorry, I was really mentioning Cynthia Weaver, right? The Lady of the Light. She is just like, stay out the dark. I'm like hovering by the bathroom in a diner. Like, what are you doing?
The first time I can vividly remember the Lady of the Light was when you're in the police station and she's like flicking the lights on and off, or like trying to keep them on, like keep the lights on. Like,
oh yeah,
it's like, are you okay, lady?
Yeah, it is funny. She's like in the background of multiple scenes, and you just like don't. There's nothing really to call attention to her other than her being creepy.
Exactly. And then it turns out her obsession with light becomes very, very apparent why she is. And it's just does such a good job taking those goofy small town characters that are just creepy. I mean, on the ferry ride over, he has to tell that one guy, like, don't tell anyone I'm here, dude. Like, I'm trying to keep this under wraps. Like, I'm famous, blah, blah, blah. Don't let anyone know. And he's like, oh, I won't tell anyone. And I definitely told everyone.
Just like immediately, like first thing he does. And then like he's like trying to get him on the radio show and everything. Like Alan Wake as a protagonist, I think is probably one of the more interesting protagonists I've played in a video game, just because he kind of comes off as an asshole for like most of the game.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes he means well, but like even to his wife, he's kind of a dick. Like he's just not a good guy. But at the same time, you're kind of rooting for him to succeed for the most part, right? I was never like, God, I hope Alan dies.
Yeah, what it did is it like effectively kept me believing that like maybe Alan is the bad guy, right? Oh. Sort of a running theme through the game is like, are you crazy? Is this something of your own doing? Or are you actually being manipulated by a demon from under the lake you're staying at, right? And I felt like it kept it plausible. At the end of chapter 1 for me, I was actually like seriously considering like, oh, are they going to pull a big twist? Did he just murder his wife? And this is his crazy story of how he deals with it.
Oh.
What do you think, Adam?
See, that's intriguing. I can totally see that because they very much set up that fight, because the whole idea is like, of course they're going to get into a fight before she disappears. And that puts so much more like tension on having to rescue her. And it makes him feel like regret. Not enough not to later punch the doctor in the face, but he's, like we were saying, he has his character flaws.
He's got a famous temper, man.
He does.
I really like seeing those flashbacks too, when you go back to his like New York apartment, and it's like a really tiny, setting just in the apartment, and you kind of see how he was before going to Brightfalls, and he's the same guy, right? Like, but it's just he's in his element, and you can tell that he's just not very good of a person. Like, he's kind of mean to his wife and like partying and drinking and, you know, just not having much regard for his family or his life at all outside of like being very selfish.
He's a good guy who's going through a rough time, man. He's suffering from that writer's block.
I was just thinking, it is your classic, like, oh, this person has writer's block because their life, or their mental state is falling apart for whatever reason, and they're just a dick. Like, I swear I've seen so many shows and movies like this. It's like every third Stephen King novel. But,
but at the same time,
it works.
I never found it. Yeah, I was gonna say I never found it like cliche or like, oh, like Alan Wake, the tortured writer. Like, I've seen this story before. It still felt fresh, and like it was just a good example of that, I guess, is probably the best way to put it.
Yeah, the hallmark of a good story and good writing, right, is one that feels familiar yet still interesting. So the game definitely has tons of like horror tropes and just general writing tropes, things you've definitely seen before. But the way they combine and mix these story elements, I think, was genuinely interesting and gripping the whole time. Like, I'm not a huge fan of like the TV show Lost or J.J. Abrams' mystery box style of storytelling. And this game started off feeling a little bit like that to me. But even the reveals and as the story goes on, it ends up much more satisfying than Lost ever was. Okay, don't watch that TV show. Play this game instead. It's a better use of your time.
It's interesting to me too, because this game, like, Austin, you were mentioning the flashbacks, and one of my favorite parts of those were the weird episodes on TV. And I mean, those TVs are scattered all throughout the game. And that adds so much to this atmosphere to me. Sometimes, you know, they're all optional, except maybe the one in the flashback. But for the most part, you'll just come across, and some of it's like Night Springs, like a Twilight Zone type thing. And it's this creepy thing going on, and it's mostly like a sort of bird's eye view of Alan Wake going nuts as he's writing this story. Or it's these radio shows of weird townspeople. I know, Jeff, you pointed out one where this lady calls in and is just like, why are the cops down by the trailer park? Those subhumans don't deserve protection of the government. Like, it's just and the dude on the radio is like, oh, thank you for that compassionate comment, ma'am. I found them hilarious. I tried to watch and listen to them every time I saw one.
Yeah, Night Springs is also a better TV show than Lost.
Oh my god!
So yeah,
the Lost hate.
This is yeah, this game did a great job of having like these extra atmospheric elements, like turning on radios and listening to the radio program, or turning on TV and watching Night Springs, that I genuinely wanted to do every time, right? Like the way you interact with it, you just turn on the TV and you could walk away, not pay any attention to it, right? But I stood there and watched it because it was just this great extra bit of content that really built the world up.
And sometimes they're like 2 minutes long. Like, not all of them, but some of them are rather lengthy. And it's like, man, they really put the work in if you wanted to stick around and watch it.
And it's all completely optional, because I watched some of them, but I didn't watch a lot of them. Or like, I would catch glimpses of them and listen to them for a few seconds. But okay, that's fine, I'll move on now. And I felt that kind of way similarly with a lot of the collectibles. I'm not a big collectible in games guy. It's not, I don't 100% things. Like, it's not something I often do. So I missed a lot of that stuff, but there is just a ton of it in here if you want to engage in that stuff.
Yeah, I did not care about getting all the coffee thermoses, but I wanted to watch more Night Springs. So, you know. With the TVs, they also do this great effect that I feel like older games used to do that you never see anymore, which is that they're actual live action scenes. Like, they have real people on a real set being filmed just to put it on this tiny square inside the video game. And I love that effect.
It reminds me of the old like Rebel Assault games with their cheesy live action Star Wars stuff. But yeah, I agree. I love that little artistic touch.
And it's something that Remedy would go on to do again with like Quantum Break, where they actually tried to basically weave in a TV show into that game, like 30-minute episodes to watch in the game. So they would continue to experiment with like live action stuff like that. So it's interesting to see that start here in Alan Wake and bleed into their later games as well. Yeah,
that's super
cool. It's a very creative. Yeah, it's a very creative studio, and I love that they're still doing stuff like that. And it sounds like Alan Wake 2 is still doing crazy stuff like that. So that's I'm excited to eventually get to that one. But why don't we go ahead and dive into maybe a little bit of the more interesting story beats? I personally, like, I've played this game twice and read a synopsis, and I'm still only like 80% sure what's going on.
Yeah, I can feel similarly about that.
Because ultimately, I think the whole deal is that Thomas Zane was the original writer at the lake, and he wrote this whole story that you play through.
So that's sort of the one cliffhanger I think they hang on, especially if you played the DLC content, which Austin, I know you didn't, but the way they lead it is they leave it ambiguous. You're not quite sure if Alan has been the puppet in his own story the entire time, if he's been the only writer, or if something happened, long before he came to Bright Falls with this guy named Thomas Zane, and he was really the one that unlocked this evil demon that is trying to escape into the world through manipulating writers and artists. I think that's the one point they leave ambiguous, but I think the rest of it is pretty much revealed, right? Like, Alan fights the darkness, he gets to save his wife, he becomes trapped in the darkness. What else do you guys think is confusing?
So Cynthia Weaver, Lady of the Light, that was originally like Thomas Zane's wife or girlfriend or something?
She was his no. His wife is the woman who's manipulating you, right? The
right, the darkness.
Oh,
the
yeah,
darkness, that's right.
But Cynthia was a friend, at least, right? Like, she knew Thomas Zane for sure. They were working.
Yeah.
She was there back when he was there originally, yes.
Yes, Cynthia is like his friend / obsessive stalker.
As some friends are sometimes.
Yeah, there's this great moment, right? Because she's gone crazy over 30 years trying to help him. There's this great moment where you can go into the basement of a destroyed building, shine your light, and see some of her writing, and it starts off with just like Thomas, and then you slowly pan around the room and just see her scribble all sorts of things, mostly his name, over and over again in the most unhinged way possible, all the way around the perimeter of the room. So obsessive stalker is what I'm going with for Cynthia Weaver.
Yeah, that was a great moment because you saw all the little yellow writing up to that, but it's usually just one thing on a wall here and there. And then you go into this basement and it looks like someone was like trapped in solitary confinement with a highlighter and just went all over the walls. It was spooky. I really enjoyed that moment.
Everything around the writing, I thought, was really well done as far as like building the atmosphere around her character and like the world around her.
But yeah, his wife is Barbara Yeager, I think her name is.
Yes, that's what I was mixing up, Barbara.
She's the personification of the demon. Apparently, the darkness took her over and is acting through her, and she's the human who's trying to trap you, Alan Wake, the tortured artist, to write a story that'll free the demon into the rest of the world.
And Thomas Zane had wrote the ending of his story to like bury the lake or bury the cabin into the lake or something. That's why all the townspeople were like, what cabin are you talking about? It's not there anymore.
Yeah, there's a sequence where they talk about Thomas Zane apparently, or actually Cynthia tells you this, right? His obsessive stalker tells you that he was actually incredibly famous and super successful and a big writer from, I guess, the earliest 20th century, somewhere around there. And he wrote himself out of the story. So that's why no one remembers this island that he was staying on or who he was. Or
I'm about to say, or
apparently
him.
He fought back. Yeah, or him. Apparently he fought back by taking himself out of the story to hide all of this, but he made a mistake.
Was there something nefarious going on with that FBI agent, or was he basically just assuming Alan was crazy? That was something a little confusing.
I actually kind of forgot about the FBI guy for a minute. That's another point where, like, this game brings in these other sort of like story elements or tangents that are like tropes, and sometimes we'll make them really integral, and sometimes they'll just throw them away and be like, hey, you don't worry about that, whatever.
The scene with the agent in the prison is almost symbolic because, he's been fairly integral to certain story parts up to that, as far as like you have to run from the cops and all that. But then the manuscript just in the darkness wish him out the door, and it's just like, no, actually, he's not important at all. He's just here to cause trouble, and now we're moving on, and you never see him again.
We haven't mentioned the manuscript pages much, right? Each episode,
You're
going around and you're grabbing pages from a manuscript that supposedly you wrote, or I don't remember when you figure out that like you're kind of writing the pages.
It was that week he doesn't remember is when he wrote them all, right?
Oh, you couldn't remember. Austin, how many of those did you read? Did you find yourself reading and collecting those?
I started the game reading them. Every time I got them, I started like reading them. I was like, okay, yeah, these are very interesting. And then I kept collecting them, right? I obviously wanted to find as many as I could just because it was like they were well lit, and you're like, ooh, a manuscript page, I want that. So I'd always go to grab it, but I did find myself kind of stopping reading them after a certain point. Did y'all keep reading them? Are they interesting throughout?
I was glued to the pages. I was so excited whenever I found one. I even kind of like explored for them sometimes. Adam, what about you?
I did fall off a little bit toward the end, but toward the beginning, certainly, I was collecting them all because not only were they kind of interesting, but sometimes they'd almost kind of hint at something coming up. Like it kind of mentions that bulldozer vaguely. Sometimes
so
it would
funny.
say things like, yeah, oh, then this may be in the DLC, but it was like, oh, and then Alan Wake found himself like surrounded. And then like 10 feet later, they come from all directions. So occasionally they would drop little gameplay hints, which I thought was really interesting.
I loved that trap. Actually, wait, wasn't that a TV though? It wasn't the manuscript page.
It could have been a TV.
Yeah, the trap I'm thinking of is like he comes on and he's like, and then Alan stepped into the trap, and so like a giant one spawns behind you, and then there's like 3 in front of you, and it's like a little corridor. So I loved spinning around, flare gunning the guy behind me, and then turning back to the front and just like taking on the horde. That was such a great moment.
Like Austin, you might not have seen these as much because I think in the DLC the videos are even a little more unhinged than they've been up to that point.
Oh,
I mean, Alan's like actually losing his mind.
He played American Nightmare though. Did you watch those?
True.
TV episodes.
They're
Austin?
similar, right?
I did watch a lot of those TV episodes, and yeah, there's some unhinged stuff going on for sure.
Yeah, so you're right, Adam. Like Alan in the DLC, you're watching Alan kind of go crazy, like writhing on the floor and babbling out plot points, right?
Yeah, yeah, and that's kind of a theme throughout the whole game is like Alan steadily going more and more crazy is kind of something that they are trying to play with most of the game, at least.
Yeah, they step it up in American Nightmare to where like it's a whole other Alan that is super crazy and like, oh man,
yeah, Mr. Scratch.
Yes, you watch him murder someone at one point. It's intense. It's dark. But Adam, you were talking about the FBI agent earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does he come back?
So the great part about the FBI agent scene that you were talking about with the manuscripts is like he actually like reads a manuscript page that references what he's doing, and that's where the game gets like full meta, right? Like he loses it, like, oh my god, what's happening? And then he gets yeeted out the door, right?
I will say, I started the second game. I think I'm the only one of us that's actually started the second game, and that FBI agent is actually important in the very beginning of the second game. So it is cool to see a lot of these elements that we're talking about here. Like Alan Wake 2 is a true sequel to Alan Wake. So a lot of this stuff here in the end of Alan Wake 1 that we're kind of wondering and questioning, I imagine will have a lot of relevance in Alan Wake 2, because right at the beginning, like one of the first things is this agent that is actually relevant. So it's kind of cool to see them continue that even after like 13 years of the game, or however long it's been. I think it's been 13 years.
Yeah, that's right.
So I do have a little bit of a question about some of this. So in the DLC, The Signal and the Rider, Zane sort of explains to Wake that he is kind of the rational version of himself, but the crazy version of himself that's giving into the darkness is like kind of the one that's in control. And he has to go find that version of himself and sort of take over. But where in all of that does Mr. Scratch come out of? That part kind of was lost on me.
So apparently in the DLC, Zane at some point calls the guy writhing on the floor Mr. Scratch, but then at the end you like go back to that Alan and it seems like you like merge with him or something. You're right, there appear to be 2 parts of yourself. Zane explains it in the DLC, and then if you play the expansion American Nightmare, there just straight up are 2 versions of you.
I'm about to say, in American Nightmare, Mr. Scratch is a completely like separate Alan.
Yeah. He's an imposter going around trying to ruin your life while you've been trapped in the darkness for 2 years, apparently. So yeah.
Oh wow, there's that much of a time skip?
So they mention it. It's like a radio show throwaway line. If you listen to the radio shows, Alice is back in the real world. She's doing things with people, and she mentions that you've been missing, and she now assumes you are dead, and it has been 2 years.
I guess they do a few things with that, right? Because in the base game, when after his wife falls in the lake, he gets in a car crash, and he doesn't realize any of this, and it's kind of explained later, but there's just a whole week missing from his memory. And that is apparently when the darkness in him wrote all the manuscript pages, right?
Yeah, that's when the darkness, the demon from some other dimension, right, is forcing him to write the story. But apparently he manages to write his own escape, which is how he wakes up in the car crash. So that's a bit of the mystery box being revealed, right? And you might find that pretty satisfying or less satisfying, but at least they gave you a good answer, right?
And I think the way they present it and the pace at which they present it keeps it pretty interesting. I never really felt like this was just total bullshit they were never going to explain, but it also isn't really rushed. I think that's one of my biggest praises of this game is everything feels pretty well paced out. There's maybe a couple sections that drag, especially like I wasn't a huge fan of some of the car parts in the sixth episode. But for the most part, I would say this game felt very well paced episode to episode.
You mentioning the driving is probably a good place to bring up some of the more like set piece type design, because most of the game is just run around with your flashlight and shoot things. But there's some moments where it kind of does some interesting things with that gameplay element. And one of those things is the kind of rock opera, like stage show, fending off all of these Taken rushing at you. There's like a big concert stage in this field where these old guys used to play. They were in like a metal band, and you show up there and all the lights are off and everything, and you flip them all on, and like just this crazy music starts blaring and Taken are rushing at you, and there's like a shotgun and all this crazy stuff. It's one of the coolest moments in the game. I know both of you love that moment.
Yeah, it was great, but we got to take a second to talk about the old gods. Adam, do you remember who the old gods were in this?
Yeah, so it's the two guys that you actually meet while you're in the psychiatric facility, right? And you find out that they're in an old metal band or something, and it gives you a little bit of information. And I thought it was cool, and I definitely did not expect to come across like a set piece that was their music playing on a stage full of fireworks and explosions. and it's at like the farm where they used to play shows or something along those lines.
Yeah. So the old gods are the two like senile dudes you meet in the diner in the very first episode. Going back to them, like, you know, always having a purpose for these characters. You're right. You then meet them later at the lodge when you're kind of locked up as an insane patient for a bit. And they help you escape. I guess you've written them into the story to help you escape. And they are hillbilly moonshiners who start a metal band. And their names are literally Thor and Odin.
Yeah, they're called the Old Gods of Asgard is like the full title of their band name. So...
yeah, exactly. So these old moonshining heavy metal rockers have a rock stage on their moonshine farm out in the country or whatever. This is what you've driven yourself out to. You and your buddy Barry, right? Which we haven't talked much about Barry, but we'll get to him more in a minute. And you have an incredible shootout on a heavy metal rock stage with all of the KISS level pyrotechnics you can imagine. So Austin, how many Taken did you murder in that sequence?
So many. I don't actually know the number, but it's so many. There's just all the weapons are lined out in front of you for you to just keep grabbing like cooler and stronger and better weapons and just blowing up these Taken. And you can like get Barry to flip on the lights and it like, you know, burns them all. And then you just keep shooting and the music is blaring. Like, that, I don't know if you know, but the Old Gods of Asgard are actually, the songs are performed by a band called Poets of the Fall, I think. They're like an actual real life band that has performed all the music for this. They performed a song from Alan Wake 2 at this year's Game Awards, actually, as the Old Gods of Asgard, right? Like they performed under that like stage name at the Game Awards this last year. So they've kind of taken this in-game fictional band and like develop the whole like lore around it.
Yeah, and that just dives more into like their sound design being so good, right? Like the game actually has a ton of like high quality songs that are performed by the live band you were just talking about. Adam, what were you gonna say?
I was going to say, one of the best parts about that segment is it keeps playing into the light and darkness. So not only do you have all the weapons you normally get, but you have pyrotechnics, you have the little lights that you can turn on that flood an area. I don't think there's any weapon in the entire base game that's not available in that segment. It is just truly like maximalism perfection.
Yeah, it's definitely the moment you've been working towards. And they don't even wait till the finale for you to do that. Like there's still a whole other episode or two right afterwards. But it is definitely like the climax for the most fun combat. And like, you know, it is
it might not be the finale, but it is the peak.
Yeah.
Well, you know, and talking about such a strong set piece, there are a couple that I didn't particularly love. Like anytime you had to run away from the darkness and like platform, kind of, sort of. Alan Wake's mechanics, as far as like running and jumping around, are not the strongest. I mean, this is a third-person game from 2010 where the focus is not platforming, so it's not like all that surprising. But I did not enjoy like jumping over the crumbling bridge at the end of the game, or a lot of those things I thought was like not the most fun, and just sprinting in general in this game is horrible. So, like
we'd be remiss not to mention some of the floating objects, the possessed objects, because they're one of my like most favorite types of enemies atmospherically and probably least gameplay wise.
Oh my God.
They're just annoying and obnoxious, but they're challenging because how many games just pick up a chair and throw it at you?
It's very true. It's very true. And sometimes, right, it's more than just a chair. It's like a bulldozer or something.
A car, a train.
I did really enjoy the atmosphere of. I think it's early on after you first start getting these poltergeist enemies, they're called, right? A poltergeist takes possession of this object and chucks it at you in the most unsettling way, right? Like it slowly rises off the ground and starts shaking steadily more violently until it just fucking nails you or you dodge it.
More likely nails you, because dodging in this game is not that easy. But
the strategy to beat them is to hide behind something it ricochets off of. And even then, it's still hard to deal with, right? But there's a sequence where you're like going through, I think it's an abandoned mining town, and it starts off throwing some like mine carts at you and some different mining equipment or whatever. And it's a few different stages, and eventually I come over a hill and I see a whole ass rusted train in front of me. And I was just, reminded of some scene from some movie where some actor goes like, choo choo, motherfucker. That's the only thing I can think in my head. And I'm like, but this is an old game. That looks like it'd be pretty hard for the game engine to do. It's not going to throw the whole train at me. And I was right. It didn't throw the whole train at me. It blew apart into like 6 pieces and threw the whole train at me. And it was so.
They found a way. They found a way to get the whole train to fly at you. That was the point.
I consistently underestimated their audacity. So.
The possessed objects are interesting too because you can't shoot them. You can only flash at them, right? So it's an entire type of enemy that bullets are totally worthless against, and you just have to shine it. But because of that, you do have to shine light on them a little longer than most of the Taken, I feel.
A little longer.
It depends on the object, but yeah.
It can be frustrating for sure, and that kind of leads into a lot of the games. Like the frustrations with the game tend to center around some of the like platforming and movement mechanics and like the time it takes to do something. Because I found the shooting in general pretty satisfying, if nothing special. I found the actual shooting of enemies though to be pretty satisfying.
Yeah, definitely, Austin. And to your point about like the platforming mechanics, I feel like anytime the darkness, which is this amorphous tornado, right, that keeps chasing and attacking you, well, whenever you hit a segment where that's like the primary enemy, it's definitely the weakest interactions in the game. Some of it is like atmospherically fun, but it can easily be the most frustrating. They have to walk this fine line of like, giving you tools to advance in the game and then taking them away. Like Adam was saying, your only weapon against the darkness is the light. And sometimes that hit well, and sometimes it was just obnoxious.
You know what other enemy only was weak to light? The birds.
Birds are scary.
Birds are terrifying.
They made this just gut-wrenching sound from behind you.
It's horrible.
If you're playing with headphones, it's like, oh my god, they're behind me to my left. Like you can just instantly feel it. And then you turn around and they're already in your face.
And it's too late by that point. Like they've already hit you. It's horrible.
They were terrible, but at the same time, I think they're a great enemy in a lot of ways because they just shake up things so much.
I would definitely agree with that. Like I enjoyed fighting the birds. I think there's that one like set piece moment where you're back at the cabin, right? Like on the island, and the birds are just like flying at you from all directions. Or is it not the island? I remember there being a segment where you're in like a cabin and there's just like birds flying at you from every direction and you're just like bouncing back and forth. I think it's actually
it's a little earlier. You're going back to get Barry from cabin, right? And it's right outside the cabin. There's birds everywhere, and they start to so that they litter the sky, and most of those aren't like real, but there's enough real ones mixed in that start to charge at you.
Right.
That was a great fight. I loved that segment.
Yeah, that was a really cool moment for me.
Did you find the flare gun for that fight?
I don't remember if I found the flare gun for that fight. It probably would have made it a lot easier if I did, though.
That is a key difference. You are able to go into that fight with quite a few flare gun rounds, which makes it not terrible, right? It's still relatively difficult with the number of bird flocks, but if I hadn't had a flare gun to just like annihilate a couple of the flocks, I would have found it very frustrating.
Now that you say that, I think I do remember having at least a couple rounds of the flare gun. Maybe not a ton, but enough that like I was able to be like, oh, look at these, 3 flocks of birds. Nope, not anymore.
Yes. It makes you be choosy about it, right? Again, going back to resource management and the good job they did giving you, just enough you need to complete the encounter well. You can take out a couple of the flocks with some flare gun shots and then, nail the other ones with your flashlight. But it is still a genuinely harrowing experience, especially when they come right over your shoulder and claw in your ear.
Yeah.
Dude, I routinely forgot that you could use the normal flares as either dropping them on the ground or like holding them and moving around. And toward the end of the game, that just became my favorite way. Like things back away from the flare, but if you walk toward them at the same time, they can't escape. And it's just so awesome to see like chainsaw guys cower away from you as you hold out a candlestick and just march them down. I love all the weapons.
The flares are so good. You pull it out, you pull it out and you're like, yeah, that's right, back up. And then you make the back up, you drop it, you pull out the shotgun, and you're like, what now? It's just great.
Not as fun as the flashbangs, but
I definitely did like the flares. I will say there was a moment early in the game, I know we've talked about off air a little bit, that y'all didn't have this problem with, but for some reason, like that early moment where the AI is shooting for you and you've lost your gun, I think it's like the end of chapter 2, and you're first introduced to flares. For some reason, I did not understand what the game wanted me to do. So I'm like pulling out my flares and like burning my flares to burn the darkness away from these enemies, but they keep backing up from me and the area is too open at the moment. So I'm burning all my flares as the enemies are backing away and they're not losing all their darkness. So I ended up like burning through all my flares, and then I found the 3 additional flares that they wanted you to pick up while like he was holding like to get the gate open. So then I burned through those flares. So then that segment where he's holding the gate, I had no flares and it was miserable. And there was nothing I could really do about it to fix that problem at that point. Like I would have had to restart the episode. There was no like go back to the last checkpoint or anything. So
you were so enamored by the flares, you forgot you had a flashlight in your other hand.
Yeah, I get, because to me, the game, it felt like it wanted me to utilize those flares. So I was using the flares. And then I guess I was unsure, or I didn't understand that the enemies weren't burning the darkness away as quickly because they were backing away from me. So I wasn't burning them with my flashlight, I was just using the flares. And once I had wasted all the flares, I was stuck there for like, I had to probably repeat that part like 7 times. And the only way for me to beat it was to just like run around in circles and get lucky. Like it was horrible.
I'm still kind of confused though. Did you just not use the flashlight?
I used the flashlight. I was using the flashlight at the part with the holding the gate. But at that point it was too late because there were too many of them. There was like 8 of them. And I couldn't take them down fast enough. Like, the flashlight didn't burn them away fast enough. That was the problem. So I'd have to, like, run around in circles, use the flashlight on them, then shoot. But then, like, 3 more were there. So I'd have to run around in circles again. And it ended up with me just being lucky at the end and managing to get through the gate. But it was my own fault, right? I was stupid. But it was horrible. It was a miserable experience.
That does feel like one of the segments where they're taking a bit more of a risk in teaching you how to use new tools. Like it's definitely a game from 2011, right? And it wasn't painstakingly obvious what you were supposed to do. So I can understand a variability in player experience, but yeah, I mean, that was definitely Austin's mistake.
I'm about to say, I'm fully willing to admit that I'm dumb, but like I felt the game didn't teach me the purpose of flares quite right. Like I thought putting out the flare was going to burn away the darkness of everybody around me. It wasn't. I think it did though.
It totally did a good job. You just weren't quite on your game during that chapter.
All right, fair enough.
It does. You do really have to kind of learn through observation at that point, right? Because yeah, you do notice. Okay, this burns away their darkness, but they retreat at the same time. That's where holding it and walking them down kind of comes into play.
Yeah, so
But it's literally a message at the bottom of the screen that just says, "Or hold RB to keep it in your hand." If you don't really notice that while you're killing things and shit's going on, you might miss that part.
Oh right, but I was holding it. I was holding it in my hand, but the thing was that like the area was so open that there were multiple of them. So like it wasn't burning away. That was.
I guess you can only walk down the ones that are right in front of you, really. But
yeah,
they did a good job with the AI of like. So I want to talk about just the enemy AI for a bit, right? I thought they did a great job with balancing its level of aggressiveness and its level of responsiveness. Like to Austin's point here, he had a hard time with them because like the Taken will correctly retreat away from the thing that is hurting them, especially if it's hurting them dramatically, like the flares. Meanwhile, like it felt like throughout the entire game, almost always they would all spawn in front of you. But they did a good job of fanning out and making a real attempt to like flank and slash at you. Did you guys feel threatened most of the time when the Taken spawned?
I would say so, particularly with enough of them, and particularly with enough axe throwers, because those guys will hit you from behind while you're focused on something else constantly. It was very sad. We were talking about the dodge a minute ago. It's not a dodge you can spam by any means, but I got to the point where I could sort of hear or feel things behind me, and every time I could time a dodge when something was swinging from behind me felt so fucking satisfying.
So good. It goes slow-mo.
Yeah, then you spin around and kill the thing that thought it was going to sneak up on you. Those were great moments.
Yeah, I know you guys liked the slow-mo effect. I thought it got tired pretty quick, I think. Maybe that's controversial, I don't know, but I felt like after a few times of it, it was just more like frustrating than anything because it's like, okay, like here's the another like slow-mo sequence. I don't know. It kind of started to bother me after a little while. It wasn't like a huge deal, right? I wasn't like, I'm going to quit this game because of it. But it did start to get a little annoying for me.
I certainly found it useful up until... I thought it was useful up until the Signal DLC. Talk about something that makes you want to quit the game. Adam, why don't you finish your thought, and then we'll jump into talking about that DLC episode.
Yeah, the only thing I really want to touch on before we get to that was going off of this escort section that we were just talking about, where the other guy has the gun and you don't have a gun. That was okay. I enjoyed it, but man, what I really enjoyed was later in the game, at Chapter 5, you meet Sheriff Sarah Breaker, and she has a shotgun, and you still have your guns. So instead of it being this thing where they're like, point the light so someone else can do all the killing, it's just like, here's a badass. It's like a reverse escort quest. She is escorting you to the objective.
100%.
I loved that.
That moment is so cool.
Yeah. I have never before seen a game that, had what is an escort quest and like maybe feel, or really like you see lots of games where it's like, hey, here's an ally to help you, right? Sarah led the way. All right. Like she is the one who got us through the church crypts. Like I was just there signing a flashlight. She was gunning people down. It was great.
There's this part where she's unlocking a door and all the enemies start to come, and I'm thinking, great, is it going to take her 30 minutes to unlock a door while I fight everything off? She just turns around with her shotgun and is like, I'll open this after. Let's kick some ass. Oh,
yes. I was like, thank you.
It's so good. It takes that moment from earlier that was frustrating for me at least, and like made it something really cool and fun that I greatly enjoyed. So that was nice.
It was really good with variety in gameplay. Every time it started to get stale, they put a little twist in it to me, and I think that really carries the gameplay through the main game.
Absolutely. I still think my favorite moment, aside from the stage fight, is when you have like a whole posse. Like there is that point in episode 5 where you're running around with Barry and Sarah, and you are taking on the darkness together, and it feels like a real winning moment.
I guess maybe we should talk about Barry a little bit before we spend 20 minutes complaining about how terrible the signal is.
I was just trying to keep the negativity going, but let's talk about Barry. Something fun.
He's Alan Wake's like agent, right? And he kind of shows up at the end of the first or second chapter when he's getting arrested. Maybe I can't remember exactly.
I think it's when he's getting out of like like when he's getting out of jail, Barry's coming in like, "Why are you messing with my client?" or whatever.
Exactly, yeah. In this very like lawyer kind of save the day moment.
Right, but he's most certainly not a lawyer.
No, he's kind of an idiot, but he's so funny, I thought. And not even necessarily him, but the moments like when he's in that cabin we were talking about earlier before the bird fight, you can turn off the lights on the way out, and he's just like, Alan, like, what are you doing? Like, sure, I guess I'll just stay here in the dark all alone. What could possibly go wrong?
Not cool, man.
He wears like a headlamp and Christmas lights for the final battle.
And it's so funny.
That's the best Barry. Headlamp Barry's the best Barry.
No, but yeah. Barry's great. He's really good comic relief. I think I was worried at the early moments. I was like, is this guy going to get really annoying? And like,
it starts off weak. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just thought he was going to be like the punchline. I was like, oh my God, like he's going to be really annoying and just, I was going to get really aggravated, but no, he's great throughout. Like he's super funny and always brings the right amount of levity to the situation. For a horror game, you kind of need that, like those little levity moments, and he does a great job of that.
Yeah, I think all of the characters are pretty great, although they do vary a lot in their screen time. Like Alice is fine, but she's in like 2 flashbacks, and then you have
she's in the first chapter. It's
Oh, that's true. That's true. Before she gets sucked in, yeah. And then Barry is how much he's on screen is a little different, but then toward the end he's there a lot, and Sarah's there a lot. And I agree with Jeff, that little trio moment at the end is probably one of my favorite like combat sections and story sections too. Writing, it's just a fun time right there.
Yeah, it does come to an end, which you quite obviously see coming. It's like, Alan, hold down the button so that we can get away, then you'll come next. And quite obviously, that's the end of your trio for the rest of the game. I was like, oh, why you gotta do this?
This garage has a button that opens at 50 feet away. I wonder what is going to happen when you press it.
Yeah, who could guess in a video game?
But even though I knew what was going to happen, I still was excited to do it, and that's the hallmark of quality game design.
I really thought I was going to find moments in this game, since I'd played it before, that I was like, just kind of pushing through this for the podcast. It really never stopped being fun up until the signal. But it was just a great game, a great time.
All right, as someone who hasn't played The Signal or The Writer, please tell me why this thing is so atrocious.
So there's the 6 episodes we talked about so far. That is the base game. That ends kind of ambiguously, and a few months later, as most games did in the 2010s, they're releasing another chapter for DLC. Right? They released 2 at different points in time. Since we're playing it so much later, we got to play them back to back. I can only assume that when they built the first DLC episode called The Signal, they heard a lot of people complain about like, oh, the game was so easy. Like, I didn't find it that difficult. And some developer got really offended and decided he never wanted to hear that complaint again. The very beginning of The Signal starts you off in the diner from episode 1. And Adam, do you want to describe that encounter?
If you can remember, Austin, how cramped that diner is, you would think, so what is it, 2 guys? Dude, it's like 10. And they come charging out of like the room in the back, the bathroom area. One just spawns behind the counter. There's no room to maneuver. I think at that point, all you have is your flashlight and your revolver, right? You don't have any of the other tools.
That's it.
That one, I died 4 times in the first fight. I'm just going to say it.
You have to fight off 3 slashy dudes and a full-on fireman with like, lumberjack guy with the axe who charges you with nothing but the base level flashlight and maybe 12 rounds for your revolver. It's garbage.
It really just had to take out the little guys while running in circles around the counter so that the big guy would chase me in circles and then just kind of turn around, use my flashlight, turn back around, keep running. It didn't feel as fun and cinematic as most of the encounters did in the first part of the game.
Yeah, I don't know if you were supposed to like dodge the lumberjack and then because like after the encounter you go out the back of the diner by kicking through a door and then there's a lamppost right there, right? So a checkpoint that kills all the zombies. But I don't know. It was just really hard. Like if you make one mistake, if the lumberjack goes the wrong way around the counter, like you're doomed. All right. If you miss 2 shots, you no longer have enough bullets to kill just enough guys to escape. Like, and that is the first encounter of The Signal, and it just gets worse. Like.
And another thing they did is, so in the base game, there are times where you don't have to fight, like you can run past to the next checkpoint, or you can clear out the enemies. It's kind of almost always an option. There's parts in this game, in The Signal, where it'll just keep spawning until you get to where you're supposed to go, or do the objective you're supposed to do. And I was not a fan of that, because I liked, oh, hey, I have a bunch of resources, I want to kill these things. And it just became, if you can run in The Signal, you're just supposed to run, I think. And then of course there's segments where you can't run and it's hard as balls. And I don't know. I didn't feel the encounter design was nearly as well polished as it was in the first 6 episodes.
It just seriously was like developers. I don't know if it was a good faith or bad faith attempt, but hearing that like, hey, the game is too easy, could you guys make it a bit harder? And rather than like balancing a couple aspects of the combat, they dialed everything up. There were more enemies, there were stronger enemies, you had less resources, the quarters were more cramped, like everything about it was harder. And that's like a multiplier effect, all right? It's not a linear growth in difficulty. You just made it 10x harder, and now I hate your entire DLC.
And it just keeps, like, there's another little cabin area where it's a super tight quarters you're fighting in. There's like a lumber yard, you're in this building in a super tight quarters. It just never stops doing that the whole episode. There are things I liked about it. They reuse a lot of the environmental assets, and you go in some of the stores in town, and you kind of get to see like the darkness version of those. And that's cool. There's some familiarity. But man, I don't think there was one encounter. How did you feel about the TV set?
I will, before we talk about how TV sets are now a trigger for me, I will give them props for the church segment. So we go back to the church. You revisit a lot of scenes in the Signal. And in the crypts this time, the crypts are like huge and they have all these furnaces in them. And if you shine your flashlight on the furnace, it like explodes. And so the whole encounter is like you working your way through this maze. You don't quite know where to go, but the maze walls are lined with bombs basically. And you use the bombs to kill the Taken. That was fun. It was novel, and it was like the only encounter in the Signal that was great. And luckily they did a lot more of that in the next DLC. But before we talk about that, we have to talk about TV sets, which is like the enemy in the Signal is inhabiting all these TV sets, and the final fight is in a warehouse where TVs just get chucked at your head while you're being stabbed to death. So,
and the thing that sucked about it really was you're in this tight room. You have this TV set in front of you with a bunch of little tiny tentacle TV sets coming off, and that's what you actually have to shine your light at, and they don't stay still. They just keep erratically moving in random directions, and it's actually very difficult to get your light on them. And while this is happening, there's an unlimited supply of Taken spawning behind you, like 2 at a time, and I thought eventually the room would run out of objects to throw at you. Not in my 9 attempts did it ever run out. Yeah, it took me almost a dozen times to beat this boss.
Oh my god.
Oh my gosh.
I had to be so methodical about it. And on top of that, the poltergeist enemies that keep spawning and flinging themselves at you, they knock stuff around the room, including the ammo and batteries that you're desperate for to try and keep this fight going. So like on multiple attempts, like they would knock over a shelf of batteries and then it would be trapped in the corner and Alan couldn't reach it anymore. And I was like, what is this garbage?
I also you mentioned this earlier, one of the best ways to deal with those poltergeist objects is to hide behind something. So there's these metal shelves in that room, and all that would happen is the thing would be so big, it would push the shelf into me and I would die. There's nothing to hide behind.
Yeah, there was a great trap. You could only sit in the corners. You had to figure out which objects were permanently bolted down and which ones were part of the physics engine. Because if you hid beside something that could move, it would murder you. It was just not enjoyable at all until you finally gunned down the last TV. Yeah.
It's the kind of encounter where the word satisfying does not come into play, but rather relief. It was over.
I was glad I finally finished.
I did not feel accomplished. I felt like I can move on with my life.
Yeah, no, definitely. So before we move on and talk about the last DLC, Austin, how did you feel the base game wrapped up? Did you feel like you had a satisfying ending?
Yeah, I think it was purposefully a little ambiguous, right? I mean, it very much felt like they were going to wrap up things in later content, whether that be a sequel or DLC or things. Like it felt like there was more to expand on, but I did feel like you had a pretty good, satisfying conclusion of where the characters kind of left off, other than the random FBI in the window. That was kind of weird. Other than random FBI agent, though, I thought things ended in a pretty good place for Alan and him being trapped and him having saved Alice. That stuff was pretty clear to me, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I think it definitely made it clear that Alice had been rescued, right? For me, the ending felt like a bit of a fizzle, which is where I really enjoyed the second DLC, The Writer, which felt like a real ending to the game. You get confirmation that Alan has traded places with Alice to rescue his wife. He's now trapped in the darkness and trying to find a way out of it and a way to fight back. So that's one of the reasons I really enjoyed it. Adam, what else did you like about the writer?
So really both the signal and the writer, if you remember late in the game, there's these words you shine a flashlight on and it kind of creates the object. So that, I guess, is an attribute of the dark place. So this is all over the 2 DLC. And in the second, the writer, the second DLC, there's actually some kind of mild platforming you have to do by making these objects appear and jumping across them. And I found myself very surprised how much I was enjoying this. Because like you said, Austin, the bridge part earlier in the game, I was not a fan of. So as soon as I saw this platforming, I was like, oh God, what am I in for? It was actually really fun. And there's a few encounters on it. There's more of the... this part where there's like all these explosive barrels you can spawn that roll down a hill as this army of taking charge at you. There's a part where there's all these spotlights and you can make cliff sides disappear so that the spotlight hit all of the enemies. I mean, the end of it is like you running through a gauntlet of like 100 of these guys, but you have these giant spotlights that are helping you out. It's just more variety in gameplay. Great, the part where they take the house and turn it into like a Ferris wheel and all of this stuff is falling on top of you. So you get to see the physics engine. I just really think the writer is a perfect example of everything this game does well in one episode.
Yeah. It's so surprising the differences between these 2 DLCs. Like the signal is them just, I feel like weirdly doubling down on some feedback about the game being too easy, while the writer feels like they really elevated all of the elements of the base game that made it a fun, enjoyable time and condensed that into like, a 90-minute, maybe 2-hour segment, depending on how you play it. And it just left me so satisfied. Like I walked away from the base game being like, that kind of fizzled. Then you play the writer DLC and you're like, that was a great experience. Please give me a sequel to this game.
Right.
Well, it sounds like the writer, based on the way you're talking, probably would have been something, at least the writer, would have been something good to play before leading into American Nightmare. Because
100%.
I feel like the beginning of American Nightmare leaves you in kind of a weird spot where it's not 100% sure what's going on if you hadn't played those things. I know you played American Nightmare before those DLCs, right, Jeff?
Yeah, that's right. So it's definitely confusing dropping into American Nightmare when you've only played the base game, and the DLCs really were the bridge. They give you a bit of a setup for like Alan is fighting against the dark place and he's trying to come up with a way to get out, and that clearly leads into American Nightmare where you kind of escape from the dark place a little bit.
Ish, sort of.
I know he does mention to, Emma, the first girl you come across, that he's like, I was trying so long to get out of this place and then I ended up here. So it is very much like the moment he escaped, he ended up in wherever this place is.
Yeah, Night Springs, right?
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah. How did you feel about the gameplay evolutions of American Nightmare, Jeff? I know, Adam, did you dabble in it, right? You played it for a few minutes, right?
Yeah, I played about an hour. I got like the nail gun and the SMG.
That's like half the game.
Yeah.
It's not particularly long, so you kind of have a feel for it. I thought the combat changes for American Nightmare, for me, worked really well. Like, obviously, this American Nightmare DLC is not really a horror game in the sense of the first one. It's more of kind of a Xbox Live Arcade game, I think, is actually what it released for. I think it released as part of like XBLA or whatever. So it feels like a low budget, like third person shooter in a lot of ways. But I kind of liked that about it. Like it still felt really satisfying to run around with like the SMG that you can get, and just like it just felt a little more satisfying to shoot things and to just engage in general combat mechanics. Do you agree?
Yeah, so the combat was a bit more fun. You're right, it's totally arcadey, right? So like American Nightmare is an expansion to the base game that is, I don't know, I kind of struggled to figure out why they produced it. I guess they wanted to release more Alan Wake content, but it's definitely a different game, right? It's like Alan Wake adjacent, it's the same storyline, it does a bit more world building, but at the end of playing it, I felt like it was potentially totally skippable. I finished the base game, waited 2 days, and then knocked out American Nightmare in a single 5-hour playing session. And I did not walk away supremely satisfied, but I wasn't angry either. You're right. By the end of it, you are running around with like a Magnum revolver and a fully automatic M16, and you are assaulting the Taken. Okay, like they have a base, and you're like, I'm gonna go take that hill now, and you start chucking flashbangs, throwing flares, and just absolutely murdering an army of Taken. So it was definitely like closer to an arcadey shoot 'em up, which I felt kind of departed from what made Alan Wake fun. I wasn't offended, but like I wouldn't really recommend it. Like you can totally skip the expansion if you want to.
I think it's worth. I think it's worth at least.
Yeah.
At least trying it out. And I do think that there is some stuff there with like Mr. Scratch and kind of getting to see more of him. And I think it's going to lead into some of the stuff with Alan Wake 2 with like the Mr. Scratch dynamic. Because even in the early parts of Alan Wake 2 that I've experienced, there is already stuff kind of being brought up with him as like, no, that's my evil dark half. Like, Alan Wake is good, Mr. Scratch is bad. And like, American Nightmare really goes into that. And I haven't played the base DLC, like the Writer, the Signal, so I don't know if they kind of dive into that or not. But American Nightmare does clearly define those things for you.
They do a good job of like continuing the story. I will say American Nightmare is set in Night Springs, the fantastic TV show in the base game. So if anything,
right.
If you liked Night Springs, play it just for that one storyline factor, just to enjoy being in Night Springs. But go ahead, Adam.
I liked some of those characters and stuff in American Nightmare 2. Like they were goofy and kind of funny. Like I liked some of those plot elements that were happening, and I liked the kind of time loop mechanic that they were working with American Nightmare.
The weapon design is so apparent how different it is, right? Because I don't think we mentioned in the base game since everything is kind of a round by round reload. You have a revolver, a shotgun, a rifle. You can hit X to kind of do it faster, and everything. Like every time I would shoot something, I'm kind of keeping track in my head. Like, okay, that's 3 shots. That's going to kill that guy. This guy's going to be a 6 shot, so let me switch to my shotgun instead. But then everything in American Nightmare is just magazine-based, and half of it's automatic. So it's just a much different feeling to knock the darkness off of something and then blah, 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 and then just hit X, and you half a second reload your mag. It's a totally different pace to the gunplay. And I was having a lot of fun with it. It probably does not feed into the horror aspects as much, but since American Nightmare doesn't have those anyway, I guess it kind of works.
Yeah, so, yeah, I just, if I wanted to play a shooter, I feel like I go play a shooter. I feel like I just played like a mediocre shooter. But at least it's short enough that it's not that big of a deal.
It's a mediocre shooter in the Alan Wake universe, though. So if you're liking those characters and those like kind of world elements, I think it's worth kind of dabbling in if you enjoyed the first game.
Yeah, no, you're totally right, Austin. And like I do appreciate that they didn't try and pretend like they were still doing the same thing from the base game. They made some design choice changes and they went with them. You get an Uzi 10 minutes into the game.
I'm about to say it's very apparent very early that this is a different game.
The other thing I noticed immediately is your flashlight recharges very quickly without batteries in this one.
Yeah.
If you just lay off of it for 2 seconds, it's back to full, which is not the case in the base game.
Yeah, they also changed the fact that it doesn't do passive damage. Like, you have to focus your flashlight to attack the Taken at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's lots of tweaks like that. Like, the lampposts aren't checkpoints. They're now literally like health packs, basically, that turn off when you get to them and then come back on later. And yeah, there's just there's a limit on the number of flares you can carry, which made me mad at first, but then they gave me an M16 and I kind of got over it.
And it's like, all right, I get it.
But yeah, so American Nightmare is interesting. It builds on the Writer and the Signal's TV set character, Mr. Scratch, apparently. We're still kind of confused about exactly who that is. But all of the TV shows in American Nightmare are even more incredibly unhinged. You are watching your evil twin, Mr. Scratch, taunt you, like, while sort of living your life and also being in the same town as you. There's one point where he abducts a groupie and murders her, like, on camera in front of you.
Yeah.
It starts off with him, like, there's this great scene where he goes through all his murder weapon tools and describes to you how he just prefers the feel of a mid-sized knife. It has the right level of oomph.
Yeah,
when
I
you
remember
stab
that
someone.
one.
Yeah,
So I only saw one camera.
yeah, that's how it starts, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Those segments, I think, are worth playing the DLC if you really enjoyed those world building elements, and you can listen to the radio shows and stuff. Austin, what did you think of the only characters you interact with who aren't Alan Wake or his evil twin, Mr. Scratch Alan Wake, are the three women in the three different levels? What did you think about the characters?
You know, they're okay. They're fine, right? Like, I like... They're kind of fun. They're a little... By the end, because the game kind of works with this time loop element, right? Where you kind of replay the sections over and over again. And each time they get a little more... what's the word, Jeff? What am I looking for?
Thirsty?
Thirsty could work.
Less thirsty. So what's definitely going on is that there is a like hot girl horror movie trope that exists, and they decided that's going to be the theme for the characters in this expansion. Right? There's only 3 levels to the game. Like Austin said, you repeat them because it's a time loop. Which is a great way to save money on game design if you only have to actually build 3 levels instead of 9.
Right.
But there's exactly one character you can talk to in all of the 3 levels. It's a hot girl, and the first one is like the sort of like rural like country town girl who gets murdered, and you help save her from getting murdered. The second one is the way too intelligent, like has philosophical debates with you scientist, but she's in a cocktail dress and a lab coat because reasons. And then the last one is the like edgy artist type who's being possessed by the darkness, and the darkness just makes her want to sleep with you. Like straight up.
That girl is she just wants to bone Alan Wake. That's just the entire... That is her entire character.
That is the joke. I get what they were doing. Like they're kind of like lampooning horror movie tropes, but I was just like, okay, like there's nothing else here. But the only characters you could talk to are progressively hornier women, and I was like, oh, this is weird.
It is revealed that she is actually Alice's friend in the real world, though. So you kind of get to see a little bit of like what Alice is doing in the real world now that she is, and you're not in the dark world, whatever it's called.
Once you defeat the last thirsty girl, you finally get to hear about the loving romance between Alan and Alice, sort of secondhand through her and some radio shows. Austin, do you remember much about the movie Alice made? That's kind of like the ending to the game.
Yeah, I remember a little bit of it, but it has been a little while since I've played it now, so I forgot some of the details. You wanna fill me in on the parts that I'm missing?
Yes, for sure. So, like, if you talk to all the characters, and as you get to the end of American Nightmare, you find out that Alice in the real world went and moved on from her photography career to make this little indie film about you. So she had taken this old film footage she had of Alan and kind of pieced it together, and she was launching it at a film premiere. And the premiere was actually at this drive-in movie theater that you somehow managed to get to. And you actually win the game by defeating the Taken, putting her movie in the projector, and like tricking Mr. Scratch into being, I guess, in a scene where the sun rises, and the sunrise kills him at the end. Which I thought was poetic enough for an arcade shooter game the way it is.
Yeah. I think it was a nice little satisfying close to what is obviously meant to be like a little bit of a bridge between their true sequel that didn't come out for another 13 years after American Nightmare.
Yeah, exactly. It kind of wraps up this detail of like, is Alan escaping the darkness? Kind of. Is he able to fight back against like his double self? Yes, he actually wins. And then like, what is going to happen next? Maybe he'll get to see Alice. She's out there. So I thought it's a good launching off point into the sequel, even though I thought the conclusion to the writer is also a fine launching off point for the sequel.
So I guess kind of some of the final thoughts on this game here for me. You know, like I said, I played it back in 2010 when it released, and I enjoyed it. I would say everything I liked about it still holds up pretty well, and everything I didn't like about it still isn't fun. So the game is still, I think, as good as it was. The sprinting is still annoying. The signal is still annoying. But all of the atmosphere is great. All of the gunplay is really fun. The characters are fun. The writing is certainly compelling enough to keep you going from episode to episode. If you're even remotely interested in kind of horror atmosphere and tight gun gameplay, that's still relatively simple, I think this is just a great game for that.
Yeah, so I completely agree that Alan Wake holds up real well for a game that is 13 years old. I was genuinely surprised since I didn't play it originally, right? Like it's in my backlog for, almost a decade and a half, that it was so much fun. Everything from the character design to the level layout to what I would even call the set design of these different encounters is just really top notch, especially coming from a 2011 game. If you like the horror genre at all, you should play it. If you like, casual shooters at all, you should play it. And yeah, you will not be disappointed in the DLC or the expansion, which are worth giving a try. This is definitely a title you shouldn't skip.
Yeah, I came into this because of Alan Wake 2 getting all of its hype and praise and everybody talking about how, innovative and interesting it is. And you can see a lot of that DNA in the first one. It's a very unique game. The mechanics revolving around like flashlights, then shooting adds a twist to shooters that like not many games really have. So there's a lot of unique stuff going on here. The story is interesting, and I'm not even a huge horror guy, but I thought the horror elements were played out really well. There's a lot here to like. There's a couple things, right, that we've talked about that I didn't love, but none of those things make it less of an overall strong package, I think. So definitely a recommendation if you want an interesting piece of gaming that is kind of different than the norm.
Well, I think that about wraps up this episode on the 2010 horror game Alan Wake.
You can find us on all the social medias at Games Gone By Podcast, wherever you might want to social media.
Or contact us by email at gamesgonebyradio@gmail.com.
Signing off for the Games Gone By podcast, I'm Adam.
I'm Austin.
And I've been Jeff.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.